Well, we've been sneaking in some rides and we've been closing in on having the end of our painting year. But we got one item left. Now, most of the bikes in my collection, I've changed the mirrors out because I want the mirrors to be further out so I can see. That's the whole objective, is to make them further out. I've got several rides on the FZR now, and these mirrors have worked out better than I could have ever expected. They are right up there in a class with the GS mirrors, which are, to me, the best I've ever had. Now, I always paint the mirrors shiny black. It's personal taste, of course, and it's just me. I like things shiny black. And as I go over to the GS, and I think, well, I like to keep the original mirrors that came with the bike. I have spares for this bike, of course, but I do like to keep the original ones. Now, the one exception to that, the RD has these little bar end mirrors, which I thought were cute, and I won't even bother upgrading them, because at the end of this year, the beginning of next year, we're going to do a full restoration on this, and probably make some major changes, make an evil twin out of it. So for right now, I'm not too concerned with the RD. And some of the bikes, like the 650, I've wound up making camera mounts that have worked with some success. Some and not, but not 100% success, because there's always some vibration in these bikes. So when I ordered the mirrors for the FZR, I ordered a set for that fairing mount, a set that's bar mount, and now what I want to do is, my objective of this whole thing, and I think you can see it right in this picture, why I wanted both. If you look down, look at the R1, they're fairing mounted. Now see, when mirrors are fairing mounted, they're a lot lower on the motorcycle, and they probably look cooler if you're trying to impress your girlfriend with how low your mirrors are. I'm not sure. That's a big item for me. The big item for me is to be able to see what the hell's going on behind me, especially when it's got red and blue flashing lights and the radar detector's going off and my heart pulses to the moon. And I'm thinking, does the guy have a gun? Among other things. But anyway, these really did work out great. And they mount, for people that don't watch all the videos, they're $14 right from Amazon. They work right up, right on. And I might even get a set. See, the thing is, I like to play musical chairs with the mirrors for a lot of reasons. It number one, not only the view going back, but when the mirrors are higher, it's a lot better for me anyway. Now, these mirrors you can't make really any higher. And look at the difference. If you look at how high one is compared to the other one, it's several inches higher. So anyway, I do have this spare set. It's a terrible rainy day. I will try to get them sanded out and ready for paint today, as one of the things I want to do. Now, I also did on the last video, or maybe it was the one before that, I tried to put on some of the tips that I learned about using these inexpensive cameras. And I know a lot of people that have an expensive camera already know that, but for the people that have basically what I call the $14 cameras, the ones that are under 20 bucks, and you can get some decent footage, but the problem is they don't have a lot of adjustment. Sometimes you just hit it right, that the light is right for that day, but when you don't, the footage is washed out, and that was the purpose of that video. Anyway, I think there was some good information on there. We'll try to put some good information on this today. Now, and because we still have Glenn's part here, that's the last of the parts that we're going to be doing this year, I hope. Unless somebody decides to visit a ditch. Here's the thing. Every sport bike, every bike in my collection has plastic parts. Plastic is a funny thing. The compounds, the formulas, and since I used to be involved in, when I had the machine shop, we did injection molding. I have a little bit of a clue as to how to deal with it, but I didn't always. Back in the 70s, I really had problems when I was painting plastic parts. And modern bikes, half of the bike is plastic, half, maybe more. It won't be long, they'll be making the engines out of plastic, I'm sure. But anyway, there are some do's and some don'ts about plastic. I'll try to share them as I sand out these mirrors and get them ready for painting. That'll be our objective today. So before I can even get started, it's raining. You can see the pond is... The fish are not impressed. The fish are heading to go get their umbrellas. Feed me, Seymour, feed me. And the other day, we got some of our plants in, but certainly not all of them. Karen, of course, will be supervising the rest of this garden. I hope you don't mind sharing a minute of it. This is one of the things she enjoys. Our big coleus down at the end on that post, that was a find. We really were happy with that. And my little monument to Chicky, my pet Baltimore Oriole. So to start the video off, these are mirrors we got for our project bike. They're going to now be spares, and maybe I'll use them on one of the other bikes. I'll see how they look, how they fit. Or, in the worst of all worlds, if I damage them, or here's what can happen with these very inexpensive mirrors. And again, these are about $14 a pair. What happens is you go to wipe them off and there's a little bit of sand or something and you scratch them. They do scratch easier. I'm sure one of the reasons they're so inexpensive is it's not a super high quality glass, that's for sure. But I don't know, so I always try to protect them. If I'm going to wipe them down, I try to do it with Windex or a soft cloth. Don't just take a paper towel and grind them, especially if you've just cleaned your chain with that paper towel. That glass does scratch. The other thing is I try not to get any paint, or as little as possible, in by the flex joint. Because that joint, the paint will start to peel and then a piece will come up, or it'll look a little less attractive than if you didn't do that. So there's a couple little things. It's not as easy and cut and dry as you think it is to get these to come out nice. But I'm going to try to share the tips. Of course, everything we do is to share the information, keep the passion for restoring old motorcycles alive. Now, there definitely are some do's and don'ts about painting these guys. There really are. I mentioned the glass. When I'm putting the tape on to back mask off the glass, it can be a little trickier than you think it is. It's not only the paint of the mirrors, but getting a nice edge here. So what I try to do, not a real high-tech thing, I try to press it down, get it level, and then starting in the middle, and I don't really have any fingernails, try to press that down in as far as it'll go. Now I've tried other ways with a little bit less success than this. Now, the trick that I've learned, and it's not really a high-tech trick, is a brand new blade. And don't hold the blade this way. Hold the blade as flat to the glass as possible. It seems like you get a nicer edge. Now, it's funny that people that may or may not know, I know people that know me my whole life know this, but when I used to paint motorcycles back in the 60s and 70s, that's how old I am. My God, I'm old. So what would happen is we were painting with lacquer and acrylic lacquer, and the thinner that you would use in some of those paints used to melt the plastic. And I thought, well, as we've gotten to modern paint, it's less and less likely that that's going to happen, but it's still likely. Here's the reason. When they mold these in China, and I see right here it says, "Hi, molded in China." Yeah, one of the things that can happen is when they mold these parts, here's an injection machine, this part here, it comes together in a machine, and under high pressure the plastic gets injection molded. It's molten plastic. It goes, makes that part. Now, the clamshell part of the mold comes apart, and this piece sometimes will stick in the mold. So what they do is they figure out ahead of time every 10th part. They take spray, it looks like WD-40, it's silicone mold release agent. And about every so many parts, depending on the temperature and depending on the plastic that they're using and the surface. See, this has a pebbly surface. A part with a totally smooth surface, they probably spray every time. But now what happens is that part, when you go to paint it, it has microscopic little pieces of what I refer to as mold release agent. And then the paint doesn't want to stick. So what will happen is right in the middle of a part, you'll see a bubble. You put this part out in the sun and also, it didn't stick. Now the way to make that it's better, you stack the deck in your favor, of course, is to totally clean the part. And I'm only masking the glass first. Then we're going to paint, we're going to clean it. The reason is I don't want to scratch this glass. The glass is very vulnerable. And I hate having a mirror on a motorcycle with a big scratch on it. And several of the bikes I've scratched because of my own incompetence. But then to sand this with 400 sandpaper, just enough, just to scuff it up, get a coat of sealer primer on it, make sure it's sealer. And then probably we won't be able to paint it today, but we'll be ready to paint black if it ever stops raining. Noah's Ark, they're building Noah's Ark out there right now. But anyway, a couple little tips. That tip of backmasking this off, holding the razor blade as close to that thing as you can. I even did at one time, I don't have it here now. I took some CA and glued a razor blade to a piece of wood so I could get it to run right along the glass. Without realizing the problem is, then it was prone to scratch the glass too. So it was it just didn't seem, it was one of those things that looked better when I thought of it than when I actually use it. Anyway, some things, we're going to get these two guys backmasked off and get ready to paint. So that results in a pretty nice, and I've tried laying 1/8" tape around there and everything. Not so good. This I've used a 3M 1/8" tape, and that's pretty much backmasked. So just like any part, the most important thing of all is to clean any grease, any mold release, anything off. Simple Green is a good way to start. Prepsol, anything you can do. Strong soap, degreaser, anything, because if we don't get a good bond right in the beginning, or if I start sanding this down and there's silicone on here, I'm just driving that silicone right down in there. Now there's a couple of things on here. I have this little made in China thing that I want to get off, because I want everybody to think I bought Rizoma parts, you know, at a much bigger price tag. Then they'll be impressed. They'll respect me if I have Rizoma parts. If they know I have Chinese parts, they're going to look at my bike and go, ah. And that's the fun of doing it. That's the fun of doing it. When you can do it for $14 instead of $150. Now, another thing, I don't want to block up that vent hole. That's number one. I'm looking at it. I got this black masked. Once it's dry, see, I give it a second or two to dry. Once this dries, I'm going to hit it with Prep Wall 2, just to make sure, because this surface, it's a pebbly surface. It's going to need a little bit of sanding to get it etched. Now the problem is, if this was glass, if this was a shiny glass, it's even more important to get it sanded. Otherwise you don't get a bond. And no matter what you're doing, if you're painting metal, you have to etch it, you have to sand it, you have to get a roughness to get the bond. That's one of the purposes of primer, is to act like glue. If you take a shiny, just go take a Coke bottle and paint it with no primer. You'll see you can just take the paint, a couple days later, peels right off. It's called saran wrapping. It used to be called Prepsol, it used to be called Prep Wall, depending on whose brand you buy. I put a note on here for myself. If you put this on and get a wet rag where it's dripping and put it on fresh primer, a lot of times it softens the primer. So what you do is, if you're in doubt, if you really have a doubt, you can do this. Take a little bit on the end of a paper towel and rub it on something. And if it doesn't take the primer off, you're fine. It isn't a problem then. But there are times, if you get too much of this on, it can be a problem. It's not a problem to go on plastic though. I have never found it melts plastic, but it is a good idea to keep in mind. Painting is only part of the thing. The word painting, the preparation is 9/10 of painting. The guy that actually paints, picks up the spray gun and paints, that's a small part of the job. It's all this preparation, getting a surface with a little scratch on it, and knowing that on plastic you should seal it, not just prime it. And on raw metal, you should put the primer on. Here's an example. This is a thing, Mark Morgan and I had a conversation one night. We were sanding something. I know Mark will remember. This is how you should paint. This is sandpaper, and you sand that metal, aluminum, steel, titanium, doesn't matter. Sand it, and the other hand has the spray can. You put the primer on, because the minute, especially if it gets wet, it starts to oxidize. At some level, the oxidation is underneath the paint, and it can cause bubbling and among other problems. So it's always a good idea to get the primer on as soon as you have a metal part sanded. Plastic, not so important. This will dry. We'll just let it dry a few minutes, and then we'll get out some sandpaper and sand it. All right, finally found some 220. Let's see, we got, you can see the number on it up here. The 220 grit. What I'll use this for, I want to get this lettering off, and I want to get any of them where the two clamshells of the mold come together. There's a line. I want to get that off. Now what that'll do is leave just enough of a scratch on it, and I'll do the whole part, of course. See, here's where the two mold parts come together. There's a lump here. What I'm basically doing is just detailing out the part. Now, of course, like any detailing operation, the final little bit I have to do by hand. Again, using some 220, some dry 220, just to make sure I don't have any spots. I don't want to have a mountaintop come through the primer. And anytime I spend at this point, it's going to be a lot less effort buffing it and sanding primer and everything. And this is a multi-day process to do this. But when you're done, I think it adds a really nice touch to the motorcycle. Something I really think it does. And my penchant for not liking anything flat black, so. But we'll be ready to put some primer on it very soon. Now I just have to figure out how I'm going to hold these while I'm painting them. Now it's tricky because we need to have a bolt that goes into that area, and yet it's big enough that I can grab it with a vice grip plier. That would probably be okay. And what's going to make this a little bit easier, because I have the nuts that I got from Bolt Depot, they sink into the plastic just enough that they stay tight. They don't wiggle around. Once you tighten the bolt up, they stay pretty solid. And sometimes painting a part like this, the trickiest part of all, it can be something you didn't think of to the very last minute, is how do you hold the part, especially when you have the clear on there. Okay, we got to mount it up. One final thing, tack rag everything off. Now we're going to use primer sealer. I've got so many different kinds of primer in this shop, and Turbo Steve was the one. I really have to thank him. He found we tried it on his project, in fact. The Duplicolor primer sealer really worked better than most of the other ones I had, and it imparts a nice thin coat, which is even nicer. It makes sanding it out just a lot better. Now, it could be that we could put a coat on here. It'll lay out nice and flat, and we'll just airbrush on some black. I'm not going to be able to paint clear today, but we can airbrush that on. But it may be that we'll see a little bit of roughness in this, and we'll let the primer dry for an hour, wet sand it, put a second coat of primer. I won't know until I actually put the primer on. I've got to do it out in the doorway, and this is just going to be a nice little project for today, for a rainy day. So one of the keys to painting anything plastic, even if you don't need to seal it, sealing it is not going to hurt. And if you look at various kinds of primer, it'll say in big letters, sealer primer. And when you have sealer primer, this usually goes on relatively thin. You would not use this primer as filler to try to fill in Bondo and the various things. They make primer for that. This is exactly what we're doing. It puts on a very thin coat, and I really don't want to have any more of this on than I have to. This is going to act as glue to glue the paint to the plastic and to seal it from any thinner that's going to want to go down in there and melt the plastic. Now, just as a point of reference, if you have a lot of Bondo work and you're trying to, especially if you're not real good at doing Bondo and you want to use this as filler, they make filler primer. Filler primer is made for that. It goes on thick like mud, and then it usually will sand out relatively easily. This is usually something you would want to put more than one coat on. Sand it, maybe put some red lead, filler primer. So if you understand, every primer is made, it has it's made for a certain purpose. And if you know what that purpose is, you can get a dedicated primer. I even noticed the other day, I don't have any here, they have high temperature primer for when you're going to do an exhaust system. So the next time we do an exhaust system, that'll be a great thing, because when I did the RD exhaust, I just put the barbecue paint right on top of the raw metal. And that's really not the right way to do it, but it's going to be due for a refreshing when we do the restoration at the end of next year. Okay, if you notice, this is self-etching primer, that this is made exactly for going over raw metal, raw aluminum, anything, titanium, anything. But you'd still want to sand and roughen up the surface a certain amount, and then let the primer do the self-leveling. Every primer has a unique purpose. So to stack the deck in your favor, you want to use the right primer. Since it's easy and it's very inexpensive, these things are usually about $5 a can. Now, Rust-Oleum makes a thing they call automotive primer. If you go to Lowe's or Home Depot or wherever, you'll see this. Each company makes several different primers, so you really want to pick the one. Now, I didn't find this to be any better than any of the ones like the self-etching primer, but I do use this for, hey, if I run out of the other stuff. I don't think this would be good on plastic. I don't like to have anything on plastic, and that's the purpose of this video, to share information. I wouldn't want to use this, although it may work on some plastics. The problem is, some plastics it's not going to work on. Now, just to fill in any information, and sometimes this is information that you find useful. This is a PPG product. And what happened? This is about $13 a can. Vlad brought 5 cans of this over here one time when we were using his, we were doing one of his restorations. I think the Benelli, but it might have been the Bomoda, I'm not sure. He bought 5 cans of this. And all 5 cans, you would spray, the primer's fine. You would spray, and as soon as you'd stop and take your finger off the nozzle, the next time you sprayed, a big glob went out onto the part. And then I looked, I said, all of these had the spray unit, they were all the same. They were all bad. So I don't know if I just had a bad batch. The primer was fine, but then the tip was maybe not the right tip, or maybe they were defective, or maybe I just don't know what the hell I'm doing, but I have 5 of them that the tip is no good on. And that's always a problem when you're going to try to share information. Sometimes the information, like the Ryobi, you know what? This is very funny too about the Ryobi. Amazon took the Ryobi back, and I'm still waiting, and it's a week later. They haven't okayed the battery going back. Now, I used the battery for 20 seconds, so I don't know, maybe there's a restock charge. But beware, whenever you order anything that you got to return. The return, of course, we're going to a third-person return. It went back to Home Depot, which went back to the seller, which then went back to Amazon. It was quite a pain in the ass. I hope it's going to be resolved in the next couple of days, but that's truth in advertising. Now, one other little tip I wanted to share. This is not an important thing. These are the little things that just make your life a little easier. Whenever I'm going to do my stuff, that there's a chance I'm not going to want to sand the primer. I'm just going to want to have one coat lay down flat, which this may be a candidate for that. Here's what I always do is use a brand new can. And here's what happens. And whether you realize it or not, this is the truth. It's probably related to that other primer thing. These caps with the little plastic insert, when you get down, say, to the bottom of the can, you're trying to use up the can, they spit. And then or they just don't spray consistently. But when they're new, it's like when you buy a new Harbor Freight spray gun for $12. The first 2 or 3 times you use it, it's perfect. About the 10th time, you start thinking, did I clean it? But then you figure, well, you've paid almost no money for it. So, and that's the case with this. This is by the way, again, thanks to Turbo Steve, this is part of our regular plastic painting entourage. The other thing, always, when you think the can is well shaken, shake it some more. Pretend you're having a Roomba contest or something. And because it's still raining out there, it's definitely not going to get the clear on, but I can get the black on today. You can get that airbrush, but I'm going to try to do 1 or 2 coats of primer. Now, normally when you do this, the first time you look at it and you spray plastic, I want to show this, because a lot of people hit the panic button. They say, oh, you can see all these scratches and little... Yep, well, that's true. And now what's going to happen, it looks like we're going to have to sand this coat of primer anyway. I'm just going to put on a coat. Half an hour or so, I'll go have a cup of coffee anyway. Let this dry up by a heating vent. Believe it or not, we still have the heat on here. It's chilly out. But get on that coat, and this will be wet sanded out for sure. I can see this is a rough enough thing. But because it's rough, it's getting a grip, and that's what's important. Here's another good tip. If this is a hot sunny day and you're in warm weather climate, 70, 80, 90 degrees outside, of course you just put this in the sun. This will bake in 10, 15 minutes. But because what's happening with us, we're in a cold weather climate, it's still chilly again. I'm under a heating vent, and I'm just going to let that cook at least an hour, because I definitely will have to sand that primer. And that's the thing. You never want to panic when you see that. And many times I've looked and said, oh, it's going to look terrible. Oh. After you wet sand that down, put another coat of primer on, it'll look fine. Well, as stuff's drying, it's a great time to have a coffee break. And it's still pouring out there. Oh my God. The rain is still pouring. But sometimes it just makes the coffee taste better. I think we have to plan the day around the idea it's not going to stop raining at all today. Not at all. So once I notice it's dry, and obviously in warmer conditions it would dry a lot quicker. And all I want to see is that little texture coming through before I put the next coat of primer on. This is a relatively quick step, but if you leave this out, the final finish is not going to be quite as nice. It'll be almost as nice, not quite as nice. We never like not quite as nice. I always like nice. Anyway, I just showed this one little spot in real time, and we'll get busy sanding these out. Not a big deal to do this. And a lot of times what happens with all these jobs, and it's very funny that it does, it's only a matter of minutes sometimes between having something really spectacular and something that's, tell-time rabbit. It's really not as nice. So here we are, and this is about as much sanding as I would want to do. That's what I would want it to look like before the next coat of primer. And we're ready for another coat of primer. I don't want to sand, obviously I don't want to sand down to where everything is, I've removed all of the primer, but I want it to just stay in all these little nooks and crannies, because each coat, and even if it needs a third coat, I don't care, each coat will level off just a little bit more before we put the black on. And if it needs 3 coats, we'll do it. It's a rainy day. In the time while I was waiting, I got all my honeydews done. I'm going to take some 1200 sandpaper. This is just a light dusting of the primer. It really dried up nice. And the longer you give the primer to dry, of course, the better. Just going to dust this off. Put some black in the air gun. Airbrush. Get your terminology right when you're working for NASA like we are. Anyway. Just one more little touch. I want this black to go on flat if I possibly can. Again, these are the things that when you skip them, sometimes you get away with it. But when you do all the steps and get it all laid out. Now the black that we use dries flat. It's the same black I used on the wheels. It definitely needs to clear, and we definitely are limited by the fact we are not going to be able to paint clear today. That's out of the question. Anytime I'm using painting clear, I always want to for sure wear a mask. Absolutely wear a mask. The other paint, yeah, it's probably a good idea to wear it, but it's not. It's nail polish, really. The other stuff, bad. Don't want to open yourself up to that problem. All right, so we're ready. I'm going to dry this off, tack rag it down. Get the airbrush laid out, the Iwata airbrush, which we've been using a lot of lately, believe it or not. Boy, getting my money's worth out of it. Okay, that's ready. And that extra little touch will make the job just a little bit nicer. Because we clean it religiously, it works pretty well. That's the whole secret to any airbrush. Keep it clean. One advantage of using an airbrush is you use less thinner and the paint goes on thinner, just like it did on the wheels when we painted the wheels. And it takes a little more time. It's a little more effort to keep cleaning the cup, cleaning it, just loading it up. But the end result is the paint usually lays down pretty nice and flat, even though this is going to dry flat when it dries. These are really nice mirrors for $14. There's a lot of nice stuff you can buy. It's cheap, and you detail it out, it looks really, really good. So we got on 3 coats about 20 minutes apart using the airbrush, and it really does put a nice coat on. And by the way, for plastic, anytime you can minimize the thinner, that you run the risk, the odds that you're going to have problems with plastic melting goes way down. No matter what thinner you use, no matter what paint, it's the thinner that's going to be the issue with the plastic. Anyway, I tried to put all the tips I could on this video. I think that worked out just about as good as I could have expected. So as I've said many times before, the secret that I've found to getting an airbrush to work well is at the end of the day, while the paint is still wet, just let it blow some bubbles. I would let that sit there for more than a minute, but in the interest of not boring the people to death, you can see it's cleaning. Let it just spray. Once it sprays, take a paper towel. Kind of a simple thing. Get all the goop from in there. And as you can see, it's nice and clean now. Now, an Iwata airbrush is an expensive thing. I don't have the Harbor Freight one, but I've always taken real good care of that one. I've had from the days of modeling in the, I don't know, 80s or 90s or whatever. And I feel bad because there was somebody who donated it to my cause, who worked for Iwata when I was making airplane videos, came to the house, donated it, and I don't remember their name. Shame on me. But if you remember, or one of my modeling friends remembers, I'd like to give him credit. And he's probably the president of the company now. I could have gotten all these airbrushes for nothing. But anyway, an Iwata airbrush is a great thing. And if you keep it clean, it'll serve you for many, many, many years. The whole trick is keep it clean. Now another thing the airbrush allows me to do is paint in this little foyer, which is in the back of the house. And you can see it's still pouring out there, but it allowed me to paint. I can't do clear, of course, and I can't do any big things like I don't know, that would smell up the whole house. Karen would probably murder me, I don't know. You know, wives with knives kind of thing. But anyway, we did get small parts like the mirrors painted today on a day we really couldn't paint outside. Of course, if you have a spray booth or a garage or something you can use, well, I'm jealous, believe me. Well, my workbench is very lonesome now. This is the last of the painting parts. Still have to get that muffler from Dime Cycle, probably 8-10 days from now. We'll take care of that. We need to make a couple other little specialty parts for the motorcycle, some special camera mounts I have in mind, and there's still a few little parts I want to polish, among other things. The whole restoration now is in its 7th month. I can't even tell people with a straight face how happy I am the way it played out. I've ridden the bike, it just rides great. The riding position is perfect for me. I can see out of the mirrors. So important for me. That's very important. When you're young, these things are not important. You can look, you can turn your head sideways. I like to see where I'm going. I like to ride as safe as possible. Maybe because I'm a coward. Anyway, being a coward is a good thing, especially at the end. I don't want to make a joke out of it. Anyway, hope you enjoyed the video. Painting plastic can be tricky. Hope there's some good information you can use. And thanks for watching.